So Director Brainerd has very kindly agreed to sit down for a few questions. So first of all, extremely impressive how the administration has managed to change the paradigm as well as the capital flows toward climate change just in the short year. You talked a lot about innovation, so I'd like to start with that in terms of questions. So the IRA and other bills, they do actually incentivize or provide tax credits to some of the technologies such as carbon capture and removal and green hydrogen that are maybe considered a bit further out and certainly a little bit controversial. If you think about kind of the largest areas of impact from the programs, do you think of those technologies that are further out as having a larger impact, or maybe versus, say, focusing on the more near-term things that we already know are proven technologies?
Yeah, so I think that is why the comprehensive nature of this historic legislation is noteworthy, because it really requires a fundamental reorientation. These are decisions that are being made by literally thousands of economic actors. And unless there's certainty that all the pieces of the puzzle are going to be sustainably reoriented in the same direction, the incentives for making any individual investment are less because the certainty isn't there. And so that is why when we talk about innovation, all the way from the most basic research to actual production at scale, we see those things as being mutually reinforcing. So yes, we think of earth shots, as the Department of Energy likes to call them, as being a piece of it, that fundamental research investment that might be going to more speculative technologies. We see that as very important because that's going to get us perhaps to where we need. We can get a very far distance with some of the proven technologies, solar and wind and EVs, but that's not going to be enough. And so we need that fundamental research for some more speculative areas in conjunction with the production tax credits, the investment tax credits that are more focused on the mature end.
So speaking of getting the rest of the way there, of course the administration's goals are to reduce emissions by a bit over half over the next decade. And even with the IRA and other bills, we're probably not going to quite get there. So what's going to get us the rest of the way there? And in particular, I'm thinking that I would think that most economists, actually, the consensus is that putting a price on carbon is the best way to reduce emissions very quickly, but the administration has a different approach. Could you talk us through the logic of the administration's approach and why no price on carbon?
Yeah, so I think the administration's approach is the boldest, most comprehensive, most decisive approach that we've seen out there. And it is an approach that combines all the different pieces of the puzzle that are necessary to work together. So, for instance, with the tax credits, the estimates that we got recently from the EPA is that we are going to get about halfway there just with those alone. But then you add, for instance, the power plant rules, and that'll take you a further distance. You take some of the more fundamental technologies that are now in development in areas that might have to do with decarbonization of industrial heat processes, for instance, sustainable aviation fuels. Those are going to take you even further. So I think the approach that we have now, first of all, it's an approach that fits the private sector innovative sort of dynamism of the U.S. economy very well. It is, as I said earlier, it is government enabled, but it is fundamentally private sector actors who are putting their own ideas and their own capital on the line. And that, in the end, I believe, is going to work together with some of the regulations and some of the initiatives that states are taking to get us to the destination that the president has set out.
So there are now quite a lot of data or statistics flying around out there about the success of the IRA or the impact of the IRA. Do you have a dashboard of your favorite performance indicators in terms of looking at monitoring the progress of the Act?
So we do have a lot of indicators, and we spend a lot of time tracking them very closely. That is everything from how quickly we are getting out the rules so that people can use the tax credits and the transferability features and some of the bonus features of the tax credits that are completely novel, which we are moving very quickly on. But we also just track investments. So $213 billion of investment after only a year. It's a pretty good number. $100 billion in clean energy alone. Again, we're feeling like that needs to continue. We have every reason to believe that it will. If you just look at areas like nameplate kind of progress, we have now pretty good projections that battery manufacturing will increase by 5 times. By 2030, that EV plants will increase by 20 times. And generally speaking, we're tracking the investments and where they're going. Again, it's very important that these investments be going to communities that may have been left behind or may be facing challenges, and there we're seeing 90% of them going to communities with less than the average weekly wages, and we have incentives for low-income communities, for former energy communities. So we're tracking a whole host of metrics, a whole dashboard, and of course, we're eager to see more progress faster, so we are not satisfied, but we've been really wowed by the response of the private sector.
So if I may, I'd like to ask about trade tensions and perhaps unintended consequences. So does the administration worry that the domestic content portion or requirement in the Act might either siphon investments and green investments away from allies such as Europe, or may reduce the overall impact on climate because it might slow the adoption of EVs or battery storage, which is battery technology, which is still very dependent on China sourcing?
Yeah, so I think what the legislation reflects and what the programs that are being rolled out reflect is a recognition that we cannot be dependent on undependable sources for certain parts of the supply chain, that will leave us in a position where we're hostage potentially to lack of confident supply for certain parts of the supply chain, or lack of access to important technologies. And so it is really important to build out these supply chains in the US as well as among partner countries where we have more integrated and aligned objectives. In terms of how the conversation with our allies and partners have gone, I think initially there was a period of explaining and educating our allies and partners on what our goals are here, and that we do see this as win-win. And increasingly what we found is, particularly with some of our near allies and partners, I think they actually see our approach as very intriguing, that they're seeing faster action in the US than they are seeing in some of their jurisdictions with very different approaches. And so what we've actually seen is countries like Canada moving in the direction of adopting similar kinds of integrated sets of policies. We're seeing a little bit of that in Europe as well. And of course, we're working on critical minerals agreements with some of our allies and partners. We're also seeing a lot of technology co-development so that there are foreign companies that are thriving in the US market, and a lot of partnerships between US companies and foreign companies that are leading to more more impressive technological breakthroughs than might have been possible otherwise. Just like we saw with the mRNA science that led to the COVID vaccines that have been so effective.
So, we've touched on the impact on everyday people, and I think at the moment they're certainly coping with the energy crisis and inflation, and we've seen in places like the UK and parts of Europe where citizens who are the least able to afford daily cost of living crises. I mean, how do they actually deal with the fact that we will actually be increasing costs from investing in the transition? How do you think about that?
So the way that the IRA is structured, there are actually really important provisions that lower costs for households. They're very significant, and we are seeing those starting to have a material impact. So, if you think about the EV credit, a family can get up to $7,000 on the purchase of an EV up front. And then save, $50 a month in prices at the pump, and $8,000 in maintenance costs over the life of a vehicle. That is very significant. That's kind of money that is left over at the end of the month that's so important for so many families. If you look at heat pumps, again, not only do you get the upfront $2,000 incentives, but you also get $500 a year worth of estimated savings on your electricity bills. And so, there are very important incentives that deliver in very concrete ways to American families, and also make us a little bit less subject to the vagaries of international commodities markets.
So you have a room full of financial institutions here. Many of them are actually at very different parts of their journey in terms of taking into account of climate risk in their risk management oversight as well as their everyday decision making. How would you advise banks and insurers in particular, who are very much going to be at the front lines of having to take into account of climate risk first? Where should they get started? How would you advise them to really incorporate climate risk?
Well, I think what we have seen just over the last few years is just so much concrete evidence that climate risk is going to be a material effect on the bottom line, and that we need to be, for financial institutions that are really in the business of managing risk, they need to be assessing, monitoring, and managing those risks effectively. And as you said, every financial institution is somewhere on their own journey, on their own level of maturity in doing that. But I do hear from investors and financial institutions that they have really taken on board that message. Of course, insurance companies, it may be the most concrete in terms of bottom line impacts, claims, damages. And so that necessitates really developing some level of modeling capability or assessment capability, depending, again, where you are on that spectrum. As you mentioned at the outset, for some institutions, scenario analysis is very useful because there are a variety of scenarios that you want to be taking into account. But the flip side of that, as we're hearing from the previous speakers, and I'm sure you've been hearing all day, there are incredible opportunities for financial institutions, for investors as well. So getting informed and taking the right approach for your financial institution to take on board both climate risks and opportunities, I think, is just very important.
Well, I think we're coming to the close of our conversation, and my concluding question for you is, we obviously have monumental challenges, but as you look out around the world, what gives you hope?
So I would say two things, just in this very specific context. One, it's really hard to get good legislation done in the US. It is really challenging. And this is not just good legislation, this is great legislation. President Biden really had a home run with these three bills. They are very well designed to address what is a monumental challenge, again, in a very thoughtful and mutually reinforcing way. So that really speaks to the U.S. Congress and to the President's leadership. And the second thing, which is absolutely necessary for those pieces of legislation to achieve, is I'm very optimistic about the dynamism and responsiveness of the U.S. private sector. I mean, we've seen this incredible set of R&D investments and capital investments all across the country, and I think we're just getting started.
Well, thank you very much. You are such an inspiration to the climate finance community and to women leaders across all domains. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.